This video today is going to be as a result of the last video we did where we talked about this machine with the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 x16 quad card. A couple of questions came up. It's going to take longer to explain it than it's going to be to actually do it, because what we're going to do is a firmware update on the Samsung 980 Pro that's sitting on this Gigabyte Aorus M.2 x16 quad card. And in the last video where we had to do a well, I need to read you the questions, because as we answer subscriber questions, when I say down the rabbit hole and in the weeds, that's where a lot of that comes from. Whether we go this way on this chipset or that way on that chipset. You guys ask the questions and we go that direction. So I love my subscribers. And by the way, this is BuildOrBuy. My name's Gil Boyd. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Got to read this to you. Now this is the second question that came up. Said, wonderful video. Thank you. Appreciate it. Did the Samsung have the newest firmware as well, and maybe performance optimized with the Magician software? Okay, Max answered that one direction, but I'm going to take it another direction as it relates to what we did with the WD Black SN850. We had to, I'll use his words, optimize performance, because you have to remember, there's three things that control how this speed works. Number one is the chipset on the motherboard. Number two is the speed of the drives, whatever the spec is. Number three, if the I/O card happens to have a PLX chip. Okay, with the two quad adapters that we have examined so far, number one being the ASUS Hyper M.2 x16 quad card. Number two being this Gigabyte Aorus M.2 x16 quad card, which we have in the first 16-lane slot. And in our second 16-lane slot is a 2-slot EVGA RTX 2080 Ti. Okay, we are on the platform, the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare motherboard, two 16-lane slots, two 8-lane slots. We have four M.2 connectors on this motherboard, two to the CPU, direct, and these two, the first one has the boot drive, the second one has nothing on it. We still have more heat sinks to test, and the other two are under one long heat sink, and those two are through the chipset. The fastest are these two. The next one is anything that goes through a PCIe slot on this chipset, which is the TRX40, and then of course the second 16-lane slot, all these slots are to the CPU. Only those two M.2 drives underneath the video card are through the chipset. So the chart I'm going to show you relates to that connection and this connection. And that's relevant because a third question came up. You guys, I love the questions. We're here to answer them. But you got to keep in mind what your specs are for your chipset number one, for your drives number two, and then number three, where they're connected, whether they're to the CPU or whether they're through the chipset. Because if they're through the chipset, you know, change one thing, changes everything. So let's go back to John's question. And I've got another one I want to show you before I show you the chart, because I've got to explain the chart we have on all the heat sinks we've tested as it relates to this, so you understand why we're going to do firmware. Now, what we're going to do is not going to take very long, but the explanation is going to take a whole lot longer. So I hope you'll stay with us for this. So to reiterate, John's question, wonderful video. Did the Samsung have the newest firmware as well, and maybe performance optimized with the Magician software? No. Easy answer. However, since we updated the firmware, and I'm going to show you the chart on the WD Black SN850, let me show you the chart. I think it'll make a lot more sense. Okay, where we're going with this is the second chart on the right, but I have to start with the first chart on the left. Now this all started when we were looking at number one, quad adapters, and then number two, we started looking at dual adapters, specifically the Supermicro dual M.2 NVMe adapter. And what we have tested in the primary position is the WD Black SN850, and in the secondary position, the Samsung 980 Pro. And of course, our video today is going to be about the firmware on the Samsung 980 Pro. Now, these are Sabrent drives. Okay, in our chart, to establish what's going on the left, number one, again, to reiterate, 12 heat sinks, and we have 20 different thermal tests. Number one, the WD Black SN850. Number two, the TRX40 Designare second heat sink. Okay, the WD Black SN850, that temperature was established when that drive was on this card in the primary position, bare at 92 degrees. And the second number, the TRX40 Designare second heat sink, which shows 65 degrees, that temperature was established with the drive in the second position to the motherboard right here, with the stock heat sink and one thermal pad. And then we proceeded with 12 different heat sinks to test. I started with 6. You guys kept adding. We got to 12. And I still think we're going to have some more to test later on. But the point is, we went with the stock product in the package. We did active and passive where it was applicable and appropriate. And if you'll notice some of the numbers, we have dual and on motherboard. And what's relevant when I say dual, we're talking about this adapter, the Supermicro dual M.2 NVMe adapter, because a heatsink can be in 3 possible places. Number 1, a dual M.2 NVMe adapter. Number 2, a quad card that needs a heatsink that does not. And so far, the quad cards we have tested that did not have a heatsink did not pass the test for you guys to even see the video. And the third position that is most relevant to most people is in that position on the motherboard, as long as it's to the CPU for the fastest. So you get a sense of all the tests and everything we've done. Okay, now let's move to the chart on the right. The first card we tested was the Asus HyperQuad M.2 x16. And the testing we do with those quad cards are in the primary position. That's a 16-lane slot, bifurcated in the BIOS to 4x4x4x4, because there are 4 M.2 NVMe drives on this card, and it requires a 16-lane slot. And that slot, in fact, all the slots on the TRX 40 are to the CPU. Okay, that is the second fastest. Primary fastest is down here, secondary fastest is here. And so what we've been establishing as we go through these devices with drives, add-in cards, or I/O cards if you want to call them, and heat sinks, is what we get for heat sink and speed. And for those that comment that say I don't know how to put it, that I'm obsessed with heat and speed, it's not me. I'm answering subscriber questions. And you guys want to go this way, we go this way. You guys want to go that way, we go that way. So as I say, in the weeds and down the rabbit hole. So trying to explain this, it takes longer to explain it, but so you'll understand it. So when we do the final, it'll make sense. So on the chart on the Asus HyperQuad M.2 x16, we have 6 drives. The first test was 4 drives, all Sabrent Rocket 4. Now, the WD Black SN850 is PCI Express 4.0, second generation, capable of 7,000 megabytes. On the Asus Hyper M.2 x16, the Sabrent Rocket 4, all of those are PCI Express 4.0, first generation, capable of 5,000 megabytes. Why is this relevant? Another subscriber, thank you for your question and comment, said that he, on his Samsung 970, established heat, I believe he said, of 61 degrees Celsius. Well, the drive he mentioned is PCI Express 3. That's a big difference in PCI Express 4, first, second, and third generation. The faster we go, the hotter we go. And so what we established on this chart, again on the Asus Hyper M.2 x16 quad card, 5 and 6. Okay, number 5 and number 6 respectively replaced drive 1 and 2 on the card, meaning the Asus Hyper M.2 x16. And those are the temps we got for those 2 drives. Okay, take those 6 drives, move them down to the Gigabyte, which was in the last test. And looking to get at John Paul Bacon's comment and question, did the Samsung have the newest firmware as well, and maybe performance optimized with the Magician software? Okay, as that question relates to our test, when we did the same thing on the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 x16 quad, first test, 4 Sabrent Rocket 4.0, which are PCI Express 4.0, first generation drives, capable of 5,000 megabytes. They run a little hotter on the Gigabyte Aorus than they do on the Asus Hyper. Here's where things got interesting when we got to number 5 and 6. Again, replacing them, to reiterate, in position 1 and 2 on the Gigabyte Aorus. Not only did the temps get a little bit hotter, but the WD Black SN850, number 5 on the Gigabyte Aorus M.2 x16, we had a problem. What kind of problem? Well, that brings up the next question that somebody else made a comment on that I want to bring you to. That's kind of long, but I'm going to cut to the chase and just read what's relevant. Because I hear what he's saying, and I agree and I understand. Could be a timing issue, maybe not the same timing issue, but could be. Let me read it. It'll cut to the chase as we get to this, so we can get this firmware update done. And this is from CLDPT. Okay, he's got a loaded system, and I agree these problems that we've had are crazy. The crux of the issue, according to an article on Tom's Hardware, and this is what they are quoting that Western Digital said. According to the manufacturer's investigation, the WD Black SN850 suffers from a drop in write performance on some X570 motherboards when the maximum payload size of the MPS is configured for 128 bytes. Yeah, this is nuts. The option basically dictates the maximum transaction layer packet, the TLP, that goes through the PCI Express controller, which is what I said, the timing issue. Obviously, a low value will cripple devices with higher MPS capability since they're forced to operate at lower MPS settings. For now, it's recommended that SN850 owners install their M.2 NVMe drives on the M.2 slot that's connected directly to the CPU and not through the chipset. If all your M.2 slots are already occupied, you may have to wait for WD firmware, which eliminates the restriction, or you get something like the Supermicro dual M.2 NVMe adapter. And if the slot this is on, which requires an 8-lane slot because you have 2 drives, then you can take it, and if that slot is connected directly to the CPU and you don't have to go through the chipset, then this is your other option. And when we tested the drives on these cards, no problem. Where we ran into a problem was on the Gigabyte Aorus. And that problem being, not only did we have more heat at 58 degrees Celsius and on the Samsung 980 Pro 61 degrees Celsius, which again, all these temps, for the WD Black SN850, the manufacturer states at rest, I believe it said 80 degrees and 85. So you want to keep the drive below 80 degrees. Okay, we're trying to see how cool we can keep these, because another location we're looking at for another video is we want to put a heat sink in a laptop. So we've got issues. And of the 3 places we've looked at for 3 possible, that makes number 4. Well, actually number 5 location is a PS5. So the PS5, we have a list of heat sinks that will work, that get those temps down, because remember, the faster you go, the hotter you go. So as we look at this, the problem we had with the WD Black SN850, with the stock firmware, that all that testing has been done. As soon as it went on this Aorus card, we had a problem. We went from a 7,000 megabyte drive to not even 5,000 megabyte. We did the firmware update, and then the performance dropped a little bit more. How much more? It was not even equivalent to PCI Express 3.0, which should be around 3,000 to 3,500 megabytes. I think we were getting like 2,500 megabytes. It was like, Lucy, we got a problem here. So what we did, powered the machine down, drained the capacitors so nothing's in the cache, powered the machine back up, voila, performance is restored. Okay, we restored performance to the drive, but when we ran the test, because the test had not had time to adequately set, which needs about 8 hours for a cold boot, the machine now has been off for 24 hours. We have a skewed test. So we're going to power this up. We're going to do the firmware on the Samsung 980 Pro, and we're going to test those 2 drives in the primary and secondary location on this card, and we're going to see if we not only can lower the heat, but possibly, because we've updated the firmware, if we can increase the performance. Now, the WD Black SN850, number 1, is a faster drive. Number 2, the Samsung 980 Pro is a little bit slower. So are we going to see any difference in performance? I have no idea. But I do expect to get a better temperature because we're on a cold boot. And so I'm going to use those new numbers in this chart. But what I'm explaining to you on this in this video, I will not in the other videos. And for those that want to see an updated copy of the chart, this is it. But the first thing we're going to do, that we're now going to do, power the machine up, run that firmware update. 2 things may happen. 1, Samsung Magician may need to be updated. We'll do that like we did with the WD Black for their control panel. And then number 2, we'll apply the firmware. Number 3, power down. Drain power, power back up, go back into Windows and do our 2 programs so we can proof what we're doing. We'll see heat on one side, speed on the other, which is what you guys ask for. And once we get this question answered, then we'll go to the next video, which was what I was planning on doing now, but since this came up in so many different ways, this had to be answered. Power up, plug in, turn on, energize. And the details matter. We see power on the video card. We can also see our postcodes, and we'll hear our power on self-test through the PC speaker. And as soon as we have boot, go back into Windows. We don't need to check anything in BIOS because we've already verified the drives. I didn't want to pull these drives off, and it's relevant to do this now before we get to the ASRock card, because when we do the ASRock card, we're going to want to examine and compare. And ASRock has made 2 cards. We're going to look at 1. And because of all this issue with PCI Express 3 versus PCI Express 4, first, second, and third generation, which deals with heat, it's relevant to keep all those things in mind. Like if you have a 970 versus a 980. All those details matter. To Windows. Windows flag E, this PC, verify the drives. WD Black SN850 is drive D, the Samsung 980 Pro is drive F. So we'll keep those 2 in mind as we do our tests. And the first thing we need to do, we have Magician installed, and it tells us a new version is available. So we're going to get it. Our current version is 6.3.0, the new version is 7.0, so it's been a while. And it sees that we're going to have a Samsung 980 Pro 1 terabyte, which is PCI Express 4.0 second generation, capable of just under 7,000 megabytes, and shows the current version for the firmware and the new version of the firmware with an update notice, an FYI. So we will update Magician first, software in progress. Samsung Magician is already installed. Do you want to overwrite the previous? Absolutely. And the setup routine. And we'll have a link up to all these different control panels. Max made a comment about updating the or installing the control panel for the Sabrent drives. Everybody's got a different one. Some of them look kind of close, kind of makes you wonder who did them. But anyway, we'll have a link up to all of them of the drives we've been testing that are listed in the description. Next, accept EULA. Good old EULA. Don't know her, but have no choice. Accept EULA. Privacy notice, like we have a choice. European Union deal. Create a desktop icon. Create a quick launch icon. Yep, I like my quick launch. Yep, install. Proceed. Carry on, wayward pilgrim. And it looks like we have stuff being installed in more than one location. Some install routines are easier to watch than others. Some install routines will also supply a README file. We're not going to go to settings. We're just going to do finish and launch. And it went ahead and found the drive and says Samsung 980 Pro, and it found it on that card. Good, 8.8 terabytes written. Normal temperature is 37 degrees, and that says 10 minutes. And what we want is our firmware up here at the top. Oh, this is fascinating. They have updated this. Now the boot drive in this machine, which is in the primary location, just so you know relevance, right under that heatsink, which is right under the Aorus quad card, indicates that Seagate FireCuda 520 is 39 degrees. We'll bring up hardware info when we get through with the update. The Samsung 980 Pro is 37, and the Sabrent Rocket 4 is 36. Good to know. I don't remember it ever doing that before. I wanted to point it out. And down here in the bottom left, it says a firmware update is available. Good. And right here it says update. Let's do it. And back up to the update screen, indicating that Samsung Magician is current. And now we're going to do the firmware update and make that current and see if it has any effect on performance, which might affect heat. Check system compatibility for the optimal SSD performance. Yes. Wow, this is different. Your computer will be shut down after updating firmware in 20 seconds. Please save all your work before updating firmware. Do you want to continue? Yes. Now see, that was one thing that was lacking with the firmware update from WD. There was no notice. The notice was about, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, but nothing about you need to repower the machine, which Max commented on, which I agree, because the unsuspecting user, that's why we, details matter, change one thing changes everything, why we said that, why we go through everything so methodically. But I wanted to point this out. I'm glad to see Samsung doing that, because apparently they would have the same issue if they didn't. Performance. Cool. So now that we have that established and the relevance, yes, firmware update is in progress. Latest firmware download completed. System will be shut down in 15 seconds. And once it reboots, then we will wait. But I'm going to go ahead when it powers off and reboots to shut it down. So the question is, does it power down? But to reiterate, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down and drain all power just to be safe. It did power down. Fantastic. Perfect. Okay. As you can see, no light and no postcode, so power's off. I'm impressed. So I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to press the power button to drain it. Hold it. Drained. Unplug just to be sure. No question. Plug it back in. Turn it back on. Energize. Beam me up, Scotty. Fans are running. Power to the video card. Postcodes. We'll hear our post. And I'm not going to go into the BIOS and double check knowing where we're at. I'm just going to go straight into Windows and check it when we get there. The drives have labels on them, so Windows will find them and keep them, but I want to make sure they enumerate correctly. Once we have the drives secured that they are there, then we'll run the test. Now I'm curious about running the Sabrent control panel. I've never done it. So, I run it, don't get me wrong, but I've never updated the firmware on an M.2 drive from the Sabrent control panel. So, we haven't had any questions about it, but Max made the comment, so I can hear it in my head. It's going to be coming up. If you guys ask about it, we'll do a video on it. But the next thing I want to do, I want to get to this ASRock. You have no idea how long I've been trying to get to that ASRock card. My original goal was to do those in succession before we got into some other stuff, but in the weeds and down the rabbit hole. Windows, we're all about answering questions. Windows flag E, this PC, we see our two drives, the WD Black SN850 and the Samsung 980 Pro, for which we've updated the firmware. So since this is about the Samsung 980 Pro firmware update, let's call up Samsung Magician and see what's going on first. And temps are up a little bit. It says at 42 degrees on the Samsung. The Seagate FireCuda boot drive is 42, and the Sabrent Rocket, which is on the quad card, is at 39. So we're still good. Temperature 42 degrees, normal. So I'm good with that. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time with that. Let's close that out. Let's now call up hardware info. We're going to be looking at sensors only because we want the smart telemetry to be read through. And since the drives are not in RAID, we have this information, otherwise we would not. So we're going to scroll down to our, okay, there's the WD Black SN850, and our test is going to be on the Samsung 980 Pro, of which we have two thermistors, the primary and the secondary. The secondary, as it's been pointed out, is for the chipset controller. So we're going to focus on the minimum, maximum, and average. So let's call up Crystal Disk Mark, and to double check in case there's any questions, Windows Flag E, this PC, and the Samsung 980 Pro is drive letter F. And those two drives are 1 terabyte drives. So we'll establish drive F, 1 terabyte with a 1 gigabyte test file, all. Highlight, and let's see where we go. Now our last score on the Samsung was 61. So I'm testing first the Samsung, but then I will test the WD Black SN850 just to double check because these are cold boots. Normally a cold boot would start like cooler than this, but it's been up long enough that we ran the firmware update, so we got a little bit of heat. Okay, performance is still the same. That hadn't changed. We won't know what we're doing on the heat until we get to the second number on the megabytes on the right. That's where we generate the most heat. Now, can we do better than the 61 degrees we had last time? To reiterate, on the Asus, the Samsung 980 Pro is at 49, whereas the Samsung 980 Pro on the Gigabyte before the firmware update was at 61. I don't know. We'll see. And for those wondering, this is a burst mode test. This is not a throughput test, but it is an absolutely fascinating test. It's amazing how one thing can affect everything else. And since the question came up, we're trying to answer it. Only one way to find out. Test and verify. Which is good advice for anybody when you buy these drives, whatever classification they are, whether PCI Express 3, and I think we might ought to take a look because of some of the questions with the X570 chipset and with a comment that came up about a Samsung 970. I think we might ought to take another look at some PCI Express 3.0 drives and spread that out and show the differences in how all that relates. Chipset, M.2 drives, and PLX chips if they exist, for which we do have another card that we're going to be looking at later that does have a PLX chip. Okay, test is complete, 58 degrees. And how does that compare with the chart? At 61 degrees. So we did a little bit better, but I've got to go one more. We've done drive F. We're going to do drive D, which is the WD Black SN850. And over here we're going to highlight and check that drive. All. Now this drive is going to come in at a faster read speed, a little over 7,000 megabytes. Oh wow, below 7,000. Well, that's interesting. We had over 7,000 megabytes when we did the test. Man, that's confusing. Aha. Keep my mouth shut and let it finish. Well, it's interesting the performance on that drive is below 7,000 megabytes. Before the firmware update on the WD Black SN850, it was over 7,000 megabytes. So make of that what you want. We're going to let this test finish because we want to know what we're going to do on heat. Test is complete, and that is most perplexing. The megabytes on the read is below 7,000. I would say that WD needs to come out with another firmware update. The writes look good, but I don't remember it in my head. I don't have that information because I'm looking at a chart for temps. Now, as we look at the temperature chart here on the left under hardware info, we're at 65 degrees, whereas our original test had it at 58 degrees. So what I get from that is we're running a little bit slower and just a little bit hotter. You know, how consistent is it? Another 24 hours, try the test again so we can do it from a cold boot. But I wanted to test both drives. Both now have the firmware update done. And I think the takeaway from this is, some of you are going to ask about what the temperature was on this. Let me show you. This comes up every once in a while. We're 45% humidity. We're 82 degrees Fahrenheit, so you can extrapolate that for Celsius. Anyway, the takeaway from this is you need to think about what you're going to do if you're going to do a firmware update. In other words, test the drive first, then test the drive again after the firmware update. And, you know, change one thing changes everything. We didn't find this out until we put this on the Gigabyte Aorus. So what's going to happen when we go to the ASRock card? You know, your guess is good as mine. All I can say is, this is BuildOrBuy. My name's Gil Boyd. Looking forward to seeing you next video. We're out.